Jeff, thank you very much. Jeff Zeleny reporting. Joining us now, Mike Rogers. He's CNN's national security commentator, the former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Mike, thanks very much for coming in. A pretty impressive show of force yesterday by the president's top national security team, all of them showing up, speaking forcefully against what Russia did during the 2016 elections, what they're attempting to do in the upcoming midterms. Yet the president says only a few hours later it's a Russia hoax.
Yeah, pretty powerful display from the intelligence community, including the FBI and the law enforcement side, and what they're doing. It's a little confounding. I passionately believe the president cannot separate this notion of which, and I think he believes this, there was no collusion on his behalf. He doesn't understand this investigation and what the Russians actually did to try to influence the election and pit Americans against Americans, and they're ramping it up. And so I think he believes if he admits that that in fact is the case, his presidency might not be a legitimate win. And I think you have to separate both of those issues, and I just don't think he can get there. But the good news for Americans is all of these folks came out. So they didn't just talk to the Russians, they didn't talk to the American public, they also talked to the workforce of the intelligence community saying, we're committed to this, we're going to unleash some of the assets.
And with all due respect to the top national security team, including Dan Coats, the director of national intelligence, the secretary of Homeland Security, the director of the National Security Agency, they were all there, the FBI director. It's one thing for the Russians and Putin to hear them, but it's another thing for them to hear from the President of the United States.
Clearly. And the one issue that you have to ask, so if you're going to disrupt Russian activities, you need some offensive capabilities. Those are considered covert action, really sensitive. Lots of thought goes into making sure that you hit the right target, you do the right thing. It needs a presidential sign-off. So if all of those guys were great, the men and women who stood there doing great things, but if you really want to disrupt going into 2018, you have to have some offensive capability. That does need to have a policy wrapped around it, and it has to have authorization from the president. That's the one thing we didn't get from that hearing.
We certainly didn't hear from the president himself. He could have showed up at that event together with his national security team, and he certainly could have discussed it later in the evening when he had that big rally out in Pennsylvania, but he was silent on that except for calling it a hoax. Usually he calls it a witch hunt. I want you to listen to Dan Coats, the director of national intelligence. He spoke about the Helsinki summit between the president and Russian President Putin, but then he uttered these words.
I'm not in a position to either understand fully or talk about what happened at Helsinki. I'll turn it over to the National Security Director here to address that question.
It was pretty shocking to hear the director of national intelligence, the top intelligence officer in the United States, say that he is not in a position to understand fully what happened at Helsinki.
That may have been the fastest handoff of a question I've ever seen by somebody in a major press conference.
Wouldn't he be briefed specifically on what happened?
You would hope so. And something even more concerned me later, Wolf, when the national security advisor came out and said, no, Putin told us what happened in the meeting. Remember when he came out and said, Putin told us that was the question that the president asked. You never empower an adversary with the narrative. And now we have to get any confirmation of what happened in that hearing, not just from the president, but Putin and his information operation crew are using this to their full advantage.
Very quickly, because I've heard from some U.S. cyber experts, counterintelligence experts say the only way the Russians are fully going to appreciate what they've been doing is if the U.S. does something similar to them. Do some hacking, go on the cyber offensive against Putin and his top oligarchs, specifically reveal some of their secret emails, expose some of the money laundering that's going on, and send that direct message to them. Maybe that will have an impact.
That is one aspect. That piece has been talked about for years. Could you disclose? Do you remember the Panama Papers and all of those disclosures? That started to get a little bit at Putin's circle and his oligarchs and the money that they were stealing. But it has to be more than that, Wolf. It can't be just, we're going to embarrass you a little bit. There has to be disruption. So we have the capability, the U.S. government, the National Security Agency, to disrupt certain cyber activities. It's hard. You have to be accurate. It's not an easy thing to do. but we can do it. Remember, that's the part that the president has to sign off on. If you're going to another country to disrupt some activity like that, it's under something called Title 50, and you need lots of authorizations. The president normally is in that chain. He could delegate, but we just don't know that piece. I'm going to guess we haven't got an idea yet what those offensive cyber actions would look like. Those are, if you want to disrupt the Russians, you absolutely have to have some offensive capability.
And you have to have the authorization to do it, but there's no doubt the U.S. has that capability.
Absolutely.
If the president of the United States were to
Do
say...
you remember when Mike Rogers came and said the president hadn't told me to do anything? Yeah. That was what was so concerning. He's the guy that needed to hear it from the president in order to have
former director of the National Security Agency, not this Mike Rogers,
Yeah, you
former
can't have
chairman of
enough
the
Mike
House
Rogers.